these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back to Hold These Truths, everyone. Joining me today is the Honorable Andrew Wheeler, former EPA Administrator and current partner at the law firm Holland & Hart. Great to be with you. Thanks for.
It's great to be with you too. Thank you for inviting me.
So I'll read a little bit about your background first for the audience. You were appointed acting EPA Administrator in July of 2018 under the Trump administration, later confirmed as the 15th Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency in February 2019. Prior to that, held senior positions in private practice at the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. I think there's a few people who understand the basics of environmental laws and regulations as well as you do, so appreciate you taking the time. Maybe also worth noting, I saw in your bio you in 2022 worked with Governor Youngkin.
Yes.
Trying to the goal being to slash regulations in Virginia by 25%. So
we did that, and also permitting reform.
Yeah.
And so far, permitting reform has shown a 70% improvement in permitting time.
That's excellent. In Virginia.
In Virginia. But
So
I think it can be modeled and expanded to other states and even the federal
Well,
government.
maybe we'll start there. I mean, what are some of the lessons you learned at the state level that could be applied more broadly? And of course, I want to get into the first administration
Sure.
story there and what kind of challenges you had. But let's start with that one. I mean, what did you learn from the state level that we should be thinking about now? As look, the term permitting reform is thrown around all the time around here. Now, the thing about permitting reform is that's cross-jurisdictional to many committees here.
Yes.
It could be natural resources. It could be my committee, the environmental subcommittee on ENC. It could be T&I. It's, how we organize committees and the cross-jurisdiction is up for debate, to be honest, given all these complexities. But what are some of the things that could be applied more broadly? And what should, like maybe to Texas, for instance?
So when I was in the Trump administration, we implemented the lean management system, which is also called the Toyota system, across EPA, which is a management review, top down, bottom up.
Okay.
And
Why is it called the Toyota system?
Toyota, I think, is the originator of the lean management system, or they're the first big company to implement that. That was back in the 70s, I believe.
Okay.
70s, 80s.
So lane management.
Lean
management.
Lean management.
Okay.
And it's a process review management structure. And we had some really good successes from that. And so when Governor Youngkin asked me to come down to Richmond and start his Office of Regulatory Management, which was an office we created, and to look at permitting review, permitting process and reforming it, we basically implemented some of the concepts from lean management into the state. But the biggest thing is transparency. You can't improve a process unless you know how long the process takes. Mm-hmm. So we basically created Gantt charts for each permit, and you can go online, and it's permits.virginia.gov,
Mm-hmm.
and every permit in the state of Virginia is available online, and you can see where it is in the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see who has it within which agency, and the office within each agency, and we established timeframes for each type of permit. Mm-hmm. So permit A may take 30 days, and it goes to 4 different shops. Permit B may take 90 days or 120 days, and we track each one, and then you track the progress for each one. So you can see where it gets held up, where the bottleneck is,
Mm-hmm.
and the managers have the information as far as the staff people, and they have their phone numbers. They can pick up the phone and call them and say, where's this permit?
Yeah.
And the public can see where the permit is in the process.
Now, is there teeth to that? So if an agency is taking too long and goes past their timeline, is there like an automatic approval?
Not an automatic approval, but for the due date for the permit, if it's due in say 60 days, that doesn't change. And if it gets held up on the day before the permit is due, the permit writer gets an automated email saying you have 1 day left. Mm-hmm. The day of, another email saying today is the deadline. Day after, an email saying you're now a day late with a permit. After 1 week, the manager gets an email generated by the system.
Now, who's the manager in this case?
It would be a career manager.
Okay, somebody in government.
Yes, somebody in government. But then after 2 weeks, the manager's manager, and then 3 weeks, the manager's manager goes all the way up to the head of the agency, gets an email saying, I think in every case it's within 4 weeks, this permit is now X number of days late. Once you start tracking that process,
that alone kind of creates accountability.
We saw a speeding up of permits across the board. But then what we also discovered was we don't really need 20 days for this part of the permit process or 10 days for that part. So you can start making reductions in the time, and you can go in and you can shorten the time span. And we've seen the environmental permits for the state of Virginia are now being processed just after 2 years, 70% faster than they were before we started tracking the progress of the permits. This transparency just does an amazing thing. Shine light on something, and you get a lot of reforms.
Okay. How many states do something like that?
As far as I'm aware, we're the only one. Now, I've talked to a number of states since we started it that are interested in what Virginia was doing. And then I'm hopeful maybe the federal government or the DOJ committee will pick up some of this. I've sent some of the materials to them. But there's, again, you can't just tell your team or your staff, okay, I want you to improve, I want you to do permits 10% faster, because you don't know how long the permit takes or where the bottlenecks are or the steps in the process. You have to, and it's working with our computer people in the state, and we did it relatively cheaply. We're talking a few $100,000, not millions of dollars, to implement this computer system that anyone can go online and look for.
Is that something that would make sense as far as legislation goes?
I think so, yes.
Do you think it would work? I mean, we're always looking for ideas. Again, the buzzword permitting reform is thrown around so often, and it's not always obvious to us legislators. Like, okay, what do we do exactly with that? But that's a pretty concrete, at least procedural change in the federal government. Maybe DOJ could take a look on. I'm not sure what they're up to these days, but it's been. But I wouldn't mind seeing some of that on paper. We come out of every meeting, whether with energy folks or whatever it is, and like, what can we do? I tend to like that idea. So it's called lean.
A lean management
system.
Lean
management. Okay, so it's already a well-established idea that's
and supplying business principles to government.
Right.
And making government more accountable.
Well, so let's talk about that for a second. Applying business principles to government, because I think sometimes, this is an obvious case where that works. One of the interesting philosophical points I make to people is, you got to have expectation management when you talk about bringing in a businessman to fix a bureaucracy, because these are by definition very different things. And I point out that in a business, you have built-in efficiencies because everybody is profit driven, and so there's a very obvious mission to that business. And you can also, and what that means is you can empower employees in that business to make decisions a little bit more quick, and delegate authority more easily, because you're not trying to control for bias, because profit is the bias that keeps everyone on track. That's not the same in a bureaucracy. And so at the EPA, for instance, the mission is not profit. The mission is help the environment.
Yes.
Well, that's a very subjective mission.
Or it is.
And you've got a lot of bureaucrats in the EPA who have very different ideas of how far they should go to help the environment. And obviously, we'll talk about your experiences there, but you're dealing with a lot of people who only join the EPA. I mean, why do you join the EPA? You join the EPA because you care most about protecting the environment. And so you're not getting a lot of bureaucrats who think very much in terms of, right, but how does this affect the efficiency of a business and our ability to grow the economy? That's really not high on their list. That's not why they joined. And so one of the things we do as a government is to control for that bias. You might call that bias the deep state. That's kind of what the deep state is, right? It's that internal bias. And to control for that, you wrap them in red tape. You give them these ridiculous numbers of procedures and regulations that they have to follow, because we're actually trying to control for the deep state. But what that does is create a massively inefficient bureaucracy. And so not all that's why I say, like, you got to have expectation management about whether, like, this romantic idea of a businessman fixing a bureaucracy, because you are talking apples and oranges, and that tension between efficiency and bias will always be there. And it's our job as policymakers to kind of figure out the right way through. And well, you just gave a great example of one way to find that right way through. What do you think about that analysis?
I think you're spot on. There is a difference between government sector, government employees versus the private sector. And having worked in both, that I think that helped me as a manager. But one thing that I always emphasize, whether I was at my current law firm, my previous law firm, when I worked for Governor Youngkin, or when I was at EPA, or when I worked in the Senate with my Senate committee staff, I was a staff director of a Senate committee, was getting the staff to focus on who their customer was.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have the same, you're right, in government, you don't have the same profit losses and financial incentives like you do in the private sector. But no matter what job you have, you need to stop and figure out who is your customer. And so many people, particularly in the public sector, don't do that.
They think
the customer is the American
EPA,
public.
they think the environment's their customer.
Right, and it's not. It's the American public.
Right.
And to make sure that you're serving the American public. And when you start looking at it in those terms, I think you can have better performance, and you can get better performance out of your team and out of your staff. When we implemented the lean management system, the senior career managers weren't crazy about it,
mm-hmm.
but the middle managers liked it because they were able to use it to get their staff to get better results.
Kind of
out
focus,
of
yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it gives
the
you
focus and get
gives
better
you a
results.
focus.
And that's what it is. It's getting in. And I went down to our Atlanta region. They had implemented lean management for the state implementation plans. These are the plans that the states submit to EPA for approval. And we had a huge backlog.
Mm-hmm.
And they put just on a giant whiteboard, they put little yellow stickies for each implementation plan that they had in the works, and they moved it along a time frame, 0 to 30 days, 30 to 60 days. And if it got late, it changed color and it moved to the bottom of the board.
Mm-hmm.
And what the managers told me was that they had some really well-performing staff who still were well-performing, but the poorer performing staff, when they saw that everybody could see their work and could see where it was in the process, started performing better. Now, we did notice in Virginia, some of the more senior people, and I was not seniors management, but had been there for a while, didn't like the new system, and they just retired. But
why do you think they didn't like it? They didn't like the accountability.
They didn't like accountability. They didn't want change. They want to have to be held to, having to get something done in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever the time frame is. But when you have that peer pressure, in addition to having manager over subordinate pressure, you have that peer pressure where you have a team of 5 people and everybody can see that one person isn't pulling their weight and the other 4 people are doing a great job.
Mm-hmm.
Then that puts peer pressure on that 5th person to start performing better. That's why I really believe in sunlight and transparency in whether it's a private sector business or whether it's a government agency or department.
Yeah.
I think that transparency really helps motivate people to do better work.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to ask you after we're done recording, to help us write a bill for that. This is why I said I like doing this podcast, because I learn something every time. That was one of the better ones I've learned so far. So, all right. Well, tell us about the environment. And by that I mean the political environment under the first Trump administration, and becoming the EPA director under. It's a bit of a different environment now, politically speaking. But back then, I mean, it was just hell all the time. I remember I only came into Congress the second half of Trump's term, but it was Russiagate. It was this. The administration was under constant fire. You were certainly under constant fire. Democrats accusing you of just trying to pollute our rivers and air and just destroy everything that we hold dear and kill all our children. And you tell me what the worst of the accusations were against you.
It was pretty bad at times. I got a lot of accusations, and the press was horrible. I have a story about the press if you want to get into that, but I just focused on the job, and I focused on our team, and we set goals, we set measurements, and we just went forward. When we did more major regulations in that first Trump administration than any other previous 4-year period at EPA. Now, the Biden administration, they came close. I'm not sure if they actually did more than we did or not, but we also did a lot of things that people didn't realize we were doing. You know, the Superfund, the toxic waste sites around the country, we cleaned up twice as many toxic waste sites in our country as the Obama administration did. And there is no news about that at all.
And what do you attribute that success to?
And the same type of management principles, getting in there and getting the staff to focus on the risk, getting them to focus on measurements and goals. My predecessor, Scott Pruitt, started the administrator's priority list of Superfund sites, and he had about 30 sites on it.
Let's define real quick what a Superfund is. Superfund site.
A Superfund site is where you have legacy toxic material pollution. A lot of the old ones were old oil refineries that are closed down, or old mines that have been closed, or paper mills that have been closed.
And how does it get designated a Superfund site?
The EPA can designate a site, but the usual process is for the state to recommend a site to the EPA, and then the EPA takes a look at it, does a number of this, and the studies can take several years to determine whether or not it should be put on the Superfund list. Yeah. And if there is a responsible party,
it's a weird name.
It is.
Why is it called Superfund?
Because back in the 80s, there were a few really big toxic sites around the country, and there were no responsible parties. There's no business that still owned the property, was abandoned. So Congress created a very large fund to clean up the sites.
Okay, large fund, otherwise known as a super fund.
Super fund.
Okay, got it.
And over the years, EPA has cleaned up sites that have corporate ownership, and there's what's called a responsible party, and they can go to court and get an order for the company to clean up the site, or if it's called an orphan site, if there's nobody left around who still owns the property, then the EPA can use funds out of the Superfund to clean up the site.
Okay.
So we
and so why wouldn't the Obama administration do more of that?
In my opinion, the Obama administration was mostly focused on climate change.
Okay, just climate change more generally,
And when we came in, we took a look and we said, okay, there's not been much attention on the Superfund program. There wasn't a lot of attention on some of the water programs, some of the other air programs. We tried to move the ball forward across the board in all the environmental indicators. Yeah. You know, the end of our administration, air pollution was down 7%. If you care about climate change and CO2 emissions, those were down under our watch. Water quality went up. I already mentioned the twice as many Superfund sites as the previous administration. Right. Across the board, all the environmental indicators improved, and during the first Trump administration.
Right. This gets to a broader philosophical difference between what environmentalism is, I think, between Republicans and Democrats. And Democrats, like you said, just tend to focus on this climate change, this global phenomenon that frankly, in my opinion, not obvious you can do a whole lot about with whatever new regulation you want to implement. I mean, we get into this fight all the time on our committee, which is, okay, so I'm just going to have a real simple cost benefit analysis. You want to implement this regulation, and you're going to tell me that all our weather is going to look like San Diego weather in 100 years? Is that, because it's not, no. It's going to have barely, if any, negligible effects and a massive cost. But that's just where their head is. And meanwhile, there's tangible things. Like I'm not against having an EPA. We need one.
We do.
But it should really be focused on these tangible benefits to quality of life. Yes. For your customer, which is the American people. I mean, American people don't like it if there's a toxic wasteland near them. That's what it, and so you got to have a Superfund cleanup. So I think that's not something that's been talked about very much in the first administration at all. I've never even heard those numbers that. What CO2 emissions you said went down 7%.
Air pollution.
Air pollution. Okay, just 7%. Air particulate pollution. And meanwhile,
CO2,
by the way,
I think went down even more.
Meanwhile, one of the Biden regulations was changing the standards. I'm forgetting the exact name. Help me out here. Yeah, the
particulate matter.
Yeah, the particulate matter standards, which is massively detrimental to future industry. So I'll let you explain exactly what that means before I like muddle through it, because I'm kind of forget. This was like 6 months ago we dealt with this.
The particulate matter, and that is a part of the Clean Air Act. It was, dates back to the 1970s. It was amended in 1990. And the law itself, in my opinion, needs to be changed, because the law requires EPA to keep ratcheting down the standard based upon the impact to human health without any regard to cost or any regard to background levels, which is a big problem that we find in Texas and out west, because particulate matter is only by particle size. It can be anything. So it's basically dust. And you're talking about PM 2.5 is 2.5 microns. So you're talking very fine dust that gets into the lungs.
Yeah.
And it could be caused from, it's typically caused from burning, fossil fuel burning, wood. Whatever you burn creates the small particles. You can get into your lungs, and it can cause health impacts. But they don't take cost into account or background levels. And we're getting to the point where the science is starting to show that there is human impact below where the background level is in some parts of our country. And if you are in non-attainment, if you don't meet the standard, then you can't increase your industrial output until you get below the standard. And in some areas of the country, it would be impossible to go below the standard because of background levels.
And so maybe a simple way of putting that, for example, so people understand what you mean by background levels. So
naturally occurring,
like California wildfires. So
yes, but even more than that, farm dust on roads, if it's not paved. Yes, and any of that.
But even all the Californians listening to the many who listen to my conservative policy podcast, and I bet a lot do.
I hope so.
It's worth noting that because if you lower those standards, which the Biden administration did do, but then you have a bunch of wildfires. Well, you just made it impossible for you to build anything in California because it's going to be deemed
in non-attainment.
But the non-attainment is a result of the background particulates, which is a result of wildfires. So does that mean you shouldn't build any? You shouldn't widen a highway? I mean, but that's basically is what it means.
That's what it means.
But that doesn't make sense to anybody who has common sense.
I mean, our air quality today, most people think our air quality is getting worse. Our air quality is between 80 to 85% cleaner than it was in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And there's not a realization. We don't.
And water quality too.
Water quality is much cleaner and safer than it ever was.
Right, like every river in America was disgusting. Now it's it's not.
Our water quality has gone up dramatically over the last. We have incredible environmental successes, and they're never talked about because the media and, quite frankly, the environmental community raises a lot of money off of scaring people, and they're not going to raise money if they say air's cleaner this year than it was last year. People aren't going to donate to that organization.
There's so many issues.
Newspapers aren't going to sell, and MSNBC and CNN I just saw the ratings come out. They're not getting viewers anyway, but they were getting fewer viewers if they weren't trying to scare people.
Yeah.
So they have to scare people, and there's not a recognition of what we've accomplished so far. And the big problem, you mentioned cost a minute ago, is we got 80% of the reductions in pollution at 20% of the cost. And now we're chasing after that remaining 20% or less of the pollution, and it's going to cost 80% more, because it's just you're getting to the point of diminishing returns where it's much more expensive to go after the remaining sources of pollution.
Yeah, and that gets to a comment I always make in committee. I'm like, look, just because one regulation is good doesn't mean that 10 more are better. There is a law of diminishing returns here, and it's at a certain point you're not taking your customer into account. I mean, the goal should be a clean enough environment for humans to prosper in.
Yes,
humans and animals, all of us. Like, I'm not against the animals. I'm an animal lover, but like the richer a country gets, it's just by definition the cleaner it gets. That's been the case around the world. This is well documented, and
wealthy countries can afford to focus on environmental problems. And which is part of the problem. I get so frustrated when we offshore our jobs, when we're importing more energy from other countries, when we're importing manufactured goods from other countries, we're creating more of a
minerals,
worldwide
especially.
pollution problem.
Yeah.
I was down when I was EPA Administrator. I was down in Florida at a phosphorus mine, and they had almost had to shut down during the Obama administration. The Obama administration went after them on some water violations. We worked with them to make sure they came into compliance.
Yeah.
And they started thriving. And when I met with the CEO and I said, "Who's your biggest competitor?" He said, "A company in Morocco." Yeah. I said, "Well, what do they do with their waste?" He said, "They dump it in the ocean."
Yeah.
And they just literally dump it in the ocean. So we produce, whatever we produce here in the United States, we produce it much cleaner and sustainably, and it's sustainable than any other country.
So, I mean, even from a business/policy perspective, how do you think we one day get around to taking away some of the Chinese market when it comes to the processing of, let's say, rare earth minerals, but they don't have to be rare earth minerals. I mean, any kind of thing that is mined generally is processed in a place like China where there are no environmental concerns. And by the way, that's the CO2 emissions from that processing, which is a lot. It goes into the global atmosphere. So if you're concerned about climate change and CO2 emissions, well, again, you're just importing it as opposed to doing it in your own country where you could do it cleaner.
Absolutely.
But what can we do to make that happen?
Treasury Secretary Bassett, when in his confirmation hearing, Senator Wyden asked him, "I need you to be strong on, because we're in a renewable energy war with China." And the Secretary said, "No, we're in an energy war with China. China is building a new coal-fired power plant every week. Their energy costs are much lower than ours. We have to have, if you look at if you're a manufacturer, you've got the cost of raw goods, you've got the labor costs, and you've got the energy costs. Those are your big three costs in deciding where you're going to put a new facility. And we have higher labor costs, and we should. Americans deserve a good standard of living, a good labor cost. So where else do you have to look? You have to look at the energy costs. And we're competing against China and other countries that are just spewing pollution. You said CO2, mercury. We get more mercury because mercury is emitted when you burn coal and fossil fuels, goes up in the atmosphere. It can travel all the way around the world before it's deposited. We get more mercury emissions in the United States from coal-fired power plants in China than we do from anything that we put out here in the U.S. And that's been true for over 20 years.
Wow.
The pollution just circles around the globe, and it can be deposited anywhere. So our majority source of our mercury pollution today is coming from China. And then you had the Obama administration and before that, the Clinton administration trying to really ramp down our mercury levels here. And it's important to reduce mercury, but we were already so much cleaner than our competitors, and we're getting more pollution from our competitors. Yeah. So there's a trade-off there. You have to have energy.
Yeah.
I worked for Jim Inhofe for 14 years, and back in the 80s, he and former Energy Secretary Don Hodel from I believe the Ford administration, did a dog and pony show where they went around the country. They'd gone back and analyzed all of the armed conflicts over the last 100 years. And I think every case but one, the side that had the greater access to energy was victorious. Energy is so important in national security that we cannot disarm ourselves on the energy side. We have to have energy production here in the U.S.
Well, yeah, and then 4 more years of a Biden or Kamala presidency would have been rough. I mean, I think we can survive 4, but I think the energy sector is certainly cheering this, just being left alone. There's a lot of things I ask them what we can do to make them make American energy more dominant, and frankly, the answer is often just leave us alone. We don't like that's it. We can outcompete everybody. We have abundant resources. But again, back to the processing question, maybe this is too detailed of a question, but it is something we would like to eventually legislate. Like what incentives need to happen? What is it? Is it a permitting change plus incentives that would help us uncorner the Chinese market when it comes to processing? And just to explain that a little bit clearer to the audience, I mean, you mine something, you mine rare earths, let's say. You got a bunch of dirt. Mining rare earths is just digging up a bunch of dirt. And then there's a massive amount of processing, which involves a lot of energy, a lot of heat, a lot of chemical use to get the rare earths separated from the dirt. They're not really that rare, as it turns out. It's just that there's just little tiny bits of them in large amounts of dirt, right?
Right.
And they're less rare in certain parts of the world. But in any case, it's the processing that the Chinese have managed to corner because they just don't care about they subsidize it, and they don't care about
the environmental
concerns.
degradation.
Is there do you see a path forward to us to at least to slowly claw that back? What kind of permitting reforms would we need on our end? Assuming we had like a 60 vote majority, so let's assume some political fantasy here. But because the first step to solving any problem is at least knowing how you would solve it, and then you got to get the politics in place, which means winning elections. But let's maybe assume that happens. Is there a path forward there, or is it too far gone?
I don't think it's too far gone. We have a lot of reserves for rare earth minerals, but a lot of them have been taken out of potential because of both Obama and Biden took so many acres of land in our country and made declarations for the Antiquities Act or wildlife areas, or there's several different.
And is that easy for a Trump administration to undo? Because I think we went over this. Like some of it, the way the law is written, it's actually hard. It's easy to do, but hard to undo for some reason.
And so the law may need to be.
Then again, we
changed
could change the law.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because it's all based on laws, so that you can change the laws and make it easier to undo. And I think we're going to have to do that at some point.
That's in the Natural Resources Committee, though, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Chinese, they have forced labor in China, and then they have cornered the market in rare earth minerals in Africa and other countries, where they go in and they exploit the local governments, and they take the minerals, and they leave environmental messes behind.
Yeah.
So there is a real problem there, but we can, and we do. We can, when we mine today. People. When enviros complain about mining and Democrats on the Hill complain about mining, they paint a picture of a mine from the 1800s.
Yeah.
They don't talk about the new technologies that are being deployed, that can be deployed, that are perfectly safe and won't impact the water and won't impact the air quality. We can mine just about anything here in the U.S. and make it environmentally sustainable. But you have to have the will to do that, and then you have to unlock our reserves. But we have a lot of reserves here in the U.S.
Yeah. Back to what it was like trying to clean up an Obama era EPA. Again, we refer to this term as the deep state, and so how did you even go about that? I mean, first of all, how many political appointees besides yourself really are there at the EPA? So if the Trump administration right now is trying to clean house, what's their ability to do that? How many positions are actually political appointees?
So we had about 120 politicals at the agency, to between 12 and 14,000 career employees. And I think the EPA now is up to about 16,000 career employees. So the ratio is
You're a little bit outnumbered.
Yes,
here.
You're definitely outnumbered.
And then what's your general vibe of these 16,000 employees? I mean, are they kind of I sort of threw that out there. I mean, I described them as their primary objective being only the environment and not helping a business get to where a business needs to get to. But I mean, I that can't be 100% true.
It's not. I started my career out of law school working at EPA as a career employee. I was a GS9 entry level, and I worked for my boss was a division director. She had about 120 people under her, and she told me that her philosophy on managing in the government is that about a third of the employees are really good, high-performing people and will work hard with little oversight, and about a third of the employees are not, and you don't give them anything important to do, and you just let them go off. And then the middle third,
send them an email and ask them to resign,
basically. And then the middle third, though, will produce if they have a manager that stays on top of them. So her philosophy
Interesting.
was trying to make sure that she had 2/3 of the organization performing really well. It is very difficult to fire somebody without a government-wide RIF, reduction in force. That is hard to do. You know,
I haven't heard that
started-
term before, a government-wide reduction in force. So is that what we should be looking at as we try?
And I think that's what President Trump is announcing or talked
Right.
about at the cabinet meeting today.
Yeah, interesting.
When I started as EPA administrator, I gave a speech to the staff and I said, you know, there is a reason why the EPA was the villain in the Simpsons movie. And there's a reason why EPA was the villain in the original Ghostbusters movie. And that is,
I didn't even know all this.
and they sat there, they had shocked looks on their face. And I said, EPA is an easy target. And part of that is because of not knowing who the customer is, not doing what the American public need or want, or not communicating to the American public what it is that we're doing. And so we worked on that.
What about in defense of some of these bureaucrats and why certain permits take so long? One thing I've heard a lot of is, well, because they have to dot every I and cross every T to a real maniacal level because of the way the courts are weaponized by environmentalist groups.
There is definitely some of that, yes. You also have slow walking from some people if they don't like the project.
Yeah,
You know,
well, that's like the
project.
definition of the deep state right there.
Yes.
Like that,
If
and
they
that's
don't
why I
like
tell
a project,
people
if they don't like an industry, they can slow walk. They can take their time. It's much harder to discipline a federal employee if they're taking too long on something.
Mm-hmm.
They say, "Well, this is really difficult." And
Yeah, it's difficult.
I need to review this
I
again.
got to be careful.
Yes.
We're going to get sued if.
Yes.
But that's also true. They will get sued.
They will get sued. Yes. And the courts are out of control there. They have been.
And that's again going back to that's laws we need to change.
Yes.
I don't know exactly what that law would look like. And hell, I'm not even sure what committee of jurisdiction that would be. Would it be judiciary? This is the problem with Congress. Like, we have all these solutions, but they're so cross-jurisdictional, which is why sometimes you need to create a select committee to deal with a certain problem.
It's tough to legislate on environmental issues. It's tough to get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate.
Extremely tough.
For an environmental issue. A perfect example is the wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
Dredging and filling in of wetlands, also called the waters of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The Supreme Court has issued 5 Supreme Court decisions now telling the government what to do, and the government keeps ignoring it. The Biden administration ignored. There was a new WOTUS case that just came out a year and a half ago, and the Biden administration completely ignored it. And they're starting to get hit by some of the courts saying you're not following the Supreme Court case.
Yeah.
But Supreme Court ruled on waters of the U.S. 20 years ago, and they came back and ruled on it again. And in the opinion, and it was I believe that was a Scalia opinion, he criticized the lower courts for ignoring the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And part of that is it takes so long to get to the Supreme Court. There was the Mercury case in the Obama administration that went up to the Supreme Court, and one of my predecessors, it took like 4 or 5 years to get there, and they overturned the EPA regulation. And one of my predecessors at the agency, her public comment was, well, the utility industry has already implemented it anyway, so it doesn't really matter what the Supreme Court said. That got the Supreme Court upset, and a lot of people think, and I agree, when the Obama Clean Power Plan regulation was, the DC Circuit was going to hear it, somebody appealed it for a stay, and the Supreme Court issued a stay on that. And they issued the stay because they wanted it to be stayed until they got to hear the case on its merits. So that's part of the problem, is it takes so long to get a case through the court system. The only reason we have the WOTUS decision was
and what is the WOTUS decision?
Waters of the U.S.
Yeah, but what exactly was the decision about? And
it was I'm confusing the cases because there's so many different cases. I believe that one was the wetlands adjacent to the water of the U.S. and whether or not the wetland had to actually touch or just be near. And it started in 2012. It went up to the Supreme Court, and it was remanded back to the agency, and then the family went ahead and kept at it, and they appealed it again in 2022. It took them 10 years to get to the Supreme Court, over 10 years, but there's 10 years between their first case and their second case. Most people, most businesses won't stick with an issue like that.
No, they have no power to.
No, it's expensive.
WOTUS is maybe spending a little bit of background time on, because I don't think anybody knows what we're talking about right now.
It's if you need a permit to fill in a wetland
Yeah.
or a pond on your property, and you have to go to the Army Corps of Engineers to get their approval.
Which seems kind of ridiculous. And I don't think that was the intent of the original legislation, right?
The
Which is
original
what the fight
legislation was navigable waters.
Navigable waters within the U.S. are subject to an EPA
EPA and Army Corps of
regulation.
Engineers regulations.
So that's a logical thing. That's a logical law that Congress passed. I don't know when.
Late 1800s.
Okay, so it's been around a while. So when did it start just spinning out of control and becoming a pond in your backyard? Like
1970s.
Yeah,
going into the 80s.
And we've been stuck with this crap ever since.
Yes.
And even though the Supreme Court overturned it, when
they did it again in 2023 was the last Supreme Court decision on this.
And so, what is the current EPA regulation on this? It's
It's still the Biden administration regulation.
So we need to bring this up to the current Trump administration and be like, you immediately need to just erase it. Just fucking erase it. It's not law. It's not legal. It's not what Congress intended.
It's not what the Supreme Court said.
Illegal.
Yes.
This is the easiest thing in the world. When you were in charge, what was the law of the land then?
When I was in charge, we repealed the Obama regulation, and we put our own regulation in place. And what we had in our regulation, actually, the Supreme Court went a little to the right of us. So I feel pretty good about our cases and our regulations. The Supreme Court affirmed what we did for the power plants, and they affirmed what we did for waters of the United States. Okay. Both of the two really big regulations that we worked on.
Are you familiar with what the current EPA is? Is this a part of their priority list? I'm assuming
it is. Both of these are part of their priority list. I think Lee Zeldin's doing a great job over there. He's only been
he's a serious
been there
guy.
for
I think
30 days now.
Yeah,
and I think he's doing a great job.
What else can he do? Looking forward, besides, that seems like low hanging fruit, obviously, since it's just a regulation on the books that's totally illegal. That seems like an easy one to redline. I'm always curious, and my curiosity stems from what I can control on my subcommittee. So my subcommittee oversees EPA. And again, we talk about permitting reform, but a lot of that permitting reform spans across T&I, spans across natural resources. When we say permitting reform regarding EPA, besides the great idea you initially led with about lean
management and more transparency,
we're going to take that one. But what else should we be prioritizing as members as we look to put some wins on the board, and what might even be? Now, here's the thing: there's room for permitting reform ideas these days, because Democrats have started to realize they need them because they want to build all their green crap. And hell, even if you want to build a transmission line, and it, I love using the example of the 10 West transmission line from like California to Arizona, 125 miles, 10 plus years. Is it done? I don't think it's done.
I don't think so.
I'm like, we went to the fucking moon in less time than that. Like, we can't even build transmission lines. And there's a lot of, and I know that the Trump administration actually expedited that.
Yes.
And it's still 10 years.
Yes. And, in the first administration, President Trump did NEPA reform, which is the National Environmental Policy Act for the environmental impact statements. And we put in there a stop clock that you have to get the federal permit done in 2 years. And enviros went crazy. The Democrats went crazy. The media beat us up. But look, what I like to point out was the Empire State Building was designed, permitted, and built in under 2 years.
Yeah,
we should be able to get a federal permit done in under 2 years. So I think it's shortening the.
Now, would it be automatic approval after 2 years? Was that what the policy was?
Almost. It didn't quite go to the complete automatic approval, but it had some requirements that if you didn't meet, you could go forward. the legal challenge timeframes would be important. It shouldn't be litigated in courts for 5 or 10 years.
No.
And then putting some real deadlines.
I mean, there's some
on the
crazy
agencies and
examples out there,
departments.
like an on-ramp to a highway in New York, litigated for 5, 10 years. And it's like, what? Who are you protecting here? Like,
It's crazy.
It's nuts. The other thing Democrats will say a lot is, well, you need to hire more people so we can have more people to review these permits. I mean, is there any truth to that?
If you have a lot of permits, but you don't need to put 100 people on one permit.
Yeah. And because I'm sympathetic to the idea that with an ever increasing demand of an ever increasing economy, sometimes you need more regulators just to make the system work faster. And like, I do think conservatives get confused about small government definitions sometimes. Like in my mind, small government means small roles. We get wrapped around like how many federal workers are working, and I'm like, there might be too much.
What is it they're doing?
What are they doing?
That's more important.
No, more important is what power do they have?
Yes.
That's to me is everything. And that's what we have to be tackling.
We need to delegate more to the states. I mean, EPA is 50 years old. The states have been doing this for 50 years.
Right.
What we end up
Texas
having,
already has. We have a very, I think, good TCEQ environmental agency.
But what we end up doing is the EPA standing on top of or next to too much. You need to delegate the program, review the program on an annual basis to make sure that milestones are being met, metrics are being met. But you shouldn't have the second guessing by the feds at every step of the process.
Right. You
need to delegate it and let the states run with it. You can shrink the size of the EPA and the EPA budget, although a lot of the EPA budget goes to fund the state programs around the country. It's a pass-through.
That's interesting.
A pass-through of grants to states to fund their own programs.
Those grants that's a whole other conversation about the IRA and the tens of hundreds of billions of dollars that went to the EPA that then went to, I don't know, Citibank or whatever other NGO to fund. We'll never see that money again. That's one of the most massive scandals in history.
There's definitely some oversight that needs to occur, and Congress, regardless of administrations, can do oversight. Republican Congress can do oversight of Republican administration. When I was working for Jim Inhofe during the George W. Bush administration, we did oversight on the way the EPA regions were operating. At that point, there were a lot of problems in the regions. Headquarters, the Bush people in the headquarters were okay on a lot of issues, but the way the regions were doing their permits and enforcement actions, we stepped in and we started going region by region. And so there's certainly oversight because you can shine light on processes within the agencies, and it's not always sexy. It's not always attention-grabbing headlines, but it can improve the way government functions.
We need to know what to look for too, and what questions to ask. And I think that's one of the problems we often have with any kind of oversight. But real quick, we ran out of time real fast. That was more of an interesting conversation, I guess, than I thought. I realized it was going to be. And I've got to run to another meeting. But one of our goals on the subcommittee, one of the chairman's goals is codify the EPA. I mean, there's kind of an interesting history in how the EPA was created by executive order.
Sure.
And it's sort of been authorized. You can argue whether it's been authorized or not by nature of being appropriated. And so one of the goals is to kind of wrap our arms around it and just to put into writing in a bipartisan way, this is all the offices in the EPA. This is their budget, what they do. Do you think there's some benefit into doing that? The logic is once you actually have it codified, you can know what to cut.
Yes, there is certainly, there's some need for that. It was created in 1970, executive order. We don't have an organic statute like a lot of departments have.
There's a bunch of laws that are assigned to the EPA to conduct, like WOTUS,
It's been tried a couple of times, and by both parties. During the Clinton administration, they tried to look at it, and they wanted to put environmental justice and climate change and some of those concepts into the statute creating EPA. And then the conservatives, when they tried to do it, they wanted to add more cost benefit analysis and more sound science.
Crazy, crazy conservatives and their cost benefit
analysis. But the Democrats
analysis.
oppose that. So both sides
it's going to be tough to come up with something.
When the Democrats had their bill, the Republicans panned it. When the Republicans had their bill, the Democrats panned it. So again, you get to the 60 vote issue.
And I think the chairman's goal is to have neither of those things, like no actual policy changes, which is going to cause consternation now that there's political pitfalls to doing that, because your own side is going to be like, you're just codifying what's crappy. And you're like, and it's hard to explain to them, this is a first step into getting to what might be a better outcome later, because you have to know what to cut. You have to know what to change.
You have to have that transparency first before you can get a process improvements.
Right. Well, I've got to go to our classified offices and start talking about defense intelligence agencies. But this has been super helpful, and I really can't wait to get with you more on lean management. And I think that's, as we congressmen always struggle with what new ideas to come up with to help this administration along and what its goals are, and making government, because that can apply not just to EPA, but to any agency that does any kind of permitting or whatever. That would be extremely helpful. Look to Virginia, of all places, and Glenn Youngkin's work and your work as an example. Maybe Texas can learn some from that as well.
Thank you.
All right.
This has been great.
Yeah, it's been great. Went a little fast. I'm sorry about that. Appreciate your being here.
Sure. Thank you.